Okay, with my apologies, we'll start this over again. This is the non-applicable clauses, permissible exclusions, exemptions webinar, developing a better understanding of what can and what cannot be excused in an audit assessment. And I am still Joseph Krolikowski, QMS Program Manager. They haven't fired me yet. Again, all of our participants today are on mute. I absolutely want to take your questions, as long as the question isn't, are we looking at the right presentation? We will have this presentation available for download shortly after we're finished. This webinar and all other past webinars will be available for reviewing under our previously recorded webinars link. Our topics for today, we're going to have a discussion on what non-applicable clauses are. We're going to review what the high-level requirements are that apply to this issue. And we're going to take an in-depth look at a requirement called outsourcing. And we're going to review where outsourcing is discussed in the 2008 and 2015 versions of the standards. We'll have a look at the impact of a limited scope, and then we will take your questions at the conclusion of our presentation. For purposes of today's presentation, we will examine these concepts as they are addressed in ISO 9001:2015, as well as its predecessor, ISO 9001:2008. Now, these same concepts appear in many other standards, AS 9100, IATF 16949, ISO 13485, but there are sector-specific requirements in those cases. Now, we do offer webinars on those standards and many other standards. I would encourage you to visit our website for further information. Now, as to what are non-applicable clauses, this is a concept that is primarily rooted in clause 4.3 of ISO 9001:2015, where it states in part that the organization's scope shall state the types of products and services covered and provide justification for any requirement that is not applicable to the scope of the organization. Now, 4.3 also requires that the scope, including details of and justification for any exclusions, for any non-applicable clauses, rather, excuse me, be maintained as documented information. Now, how was this approached in the ISO 9001:2008 standard? Non-applicable clauses, that phrase, it replaces the former concept, permissible exclusions, which was discussed in clause 1.2 of ISO 9001:2008, and it stated, where any requirement of this international standard cannot be applied due to the nature of an organization and its product, this can be considered for exclusion. Now, ISO 9001 also had a requirement for a quality manual, and that requirement appeared in section 422A. And it added another layer, and it said that your exclusions and those justifications had to be documented within a quality manual. Now, for our presentation today, we're going to be referring to both permissible exclusions and non-applicable clauses under the innocuous term exemptions. So let's try to define this term exemptions in plain English. ISO 9001:2008 and ISO 9001:2015 both essentially say the same thing when it comes to exemptions. For an exemption to be truly justified, it must be something that is not part of the organization's quality management system as defined by the scope. Now let's dig a little deeper and get a better sense of how we are to understand this requirement. Let's start with some high-level requirements. We have guidance from the TC 176 committee. Now that's the committee that wrote ISO 9001 and is responsible for updating it. They wrote the 2008, the 2015 versions, all the way back to the original publication. We have the ISO 9001 Auditing Practices Group, or APG. Now this is a joint committee that represents both ISO and IAF. We have content within the ISO 9001 2015 standard itself, both auditable content and guidance content. And finally, we have the 9002 guidance document, Quality Management Systems Guidelines for Application of ISO 9001 2015. So there's a lot that we can draw on to understand what's expected here. So let's go back in time a little bit and let's take a look at the TC 176 committee position papers. Back in 2008, shortly after the 9001-2008 standard was published, the TC 176 committee issued 2 officially binding guidance documents. Now these were called Guidance on 9001-2008 Subclause 1.2 Application and Guidance on Outsourced Processes. And these were, the shorthand was 524R6 and 630R3. Now these 2 papers taken together included a requirement for many organizations, auditors, and certification bodies that those folks felt was rather controversial. So what was stated that was so controversial? Well, the 2 guidance documents provided numerous permutations pertaining to exemptions, most of which were well understood, but one item stood out as particularly controversial. So from guidance document 524R6, examples of situations where conformity to ISO 9001-2008 should not be claimed include where an organization excludes a requirement on the basis that the activity has been outsourced. And then from guidance document 630R3, the intent of clause 4.1 of ISO 9001-2008 is to emphasize that when an organization chooses to outsource, either permanently or temporarily, a process that affects product conformity with requirements, it cannot simply ignore this process, nor exclude it from the quality management system. So in other words, any exemption that is rooted in outsourcing is not an acceptable exemption, and it should result in a nonconformance during the audit. Now this is guidance from the committee that wrote the standard. There is no getting around this guidance. Now obviously the elephant in the room with all this is design. Now PJR has had past clients who have claimed an exemption from design and development on the basis that designs were provided by their parent or sister company. Now those exemptions are potentially not appropriate and should not have been automatically accepted. We're going to be providing some clarification on this a little bit later in the presentation. There are 2 basic justifications to exempt design and development. Either you are receiving a complete product design from your customers, or you do not manufacture products based on a product design. You're a warehouse, you're a distributorship, perhaps a service company. There is a third option that we're going to be exploring a little bit later in the presentation here. So how can PJR audit something that I don't do? Now this is a common response that we get from clients and from auditors expressing frustration over this. You have to remember that we're not auditing the actual activity. We're auditing the outsourcing controls that have been applied to it. So what is outsourcing? We'll begin with a review of the definition that's provided in the 9000 document, which is Fundamentals in Vocabulary. Outsource is to make an arrangement where an external organization performs part of an organization's function or process. Now, it's important to note the phrase an organization's function or process. That means that the organization still has ownership of the function or process, even if they don't perform it in their facility. And that is emphasized in the note that appears in tandem with the definition. It states that an external organization is outside of the scope of the management system, but the outsourced function or process is within the scope. And that's kind of the key distinction, is that it's the process that's within the scope, not the external organization. So what are some processes that are typically going to be outsourced? Now, we've paired these with clauses from 9001:2015. Calibration is very common. We bring in an outside lab or an outside source to calibrate our measurement devices. Training, another very common item. We send people for a class, or we bring in an outside trainer. Customer service, a lot of organizations have a centralized customer service activity. Design, as we've mentioned. Purchasing even. If you are part of a corporate structure, often corporate wants the spending, so to speak, to be centralized. Even things like manufacturing, testing, and non-conforming product disposal can be outsourced activities. So where is outsourcing discussed in ISO 9001:2008? Well, it's discussed in a couple of key places. Where an organization chooses to outsource any process that affects product conformity, the organization shall ensure control over such processes. That's written right at the front end of the standard in section 4.1. Now, how about the 2015 standard? It appears in two places in 2015. In the standard itself, in section 8, it states that the organization shall ensure that externally provided processes, products, and services conform to requirements. That's part of section 8.4. And then it goes on to state that all forms of externally provided processes, products, and services are addressed in 8.4, whether through an arrangement with an associate company or outsourcing processes to an external provider. That's in Annex A8. This is part of the larger view of external providers, that it goes beyond traditional suppliers, and this is meant to be a very inclusive term. Now, outsourcing is discussed in a number of other relevant publications. From ISO 9002, it states that external providers could include corporate headquarters, could include associate companies, suppliers, or someone to whom the organization has outsourced a process. The Auditing Practices Group had a weigh-in on this when they wrote their guidance document for scope of ISO 9001. That document indicated that outsourcing is to be considered an input to the development of an organization's scope. Now remember, when we audit an outsourced activity, we are not auditing the actual activity itself. We are confirming that appropriate controls have been established. So what do we mean by controls for outsourced activities? Well, there's a number of ways that you can control an outsourced activity. Now, here's a short list of what might be part of that process. You might have contracts established with your subcontractors. You may have issued purchase orders. You may have email communication. You may have a set of terms and conditions outlined on your website. You may have audits that you perform at the external provider. You may require that the external provider have some sort of management system certification, such as ISO 9001. You may even have work instructions that you write and provide to the external provider. So there's a lot of ways that an outsourced process can be controlled. So for example, consider the case of a company that chooses to outsource 100% of their calibration or verification activity to a calibration laboratory. So what would we review as auditors? We could review the contract that you've issued to the laboratory. We're very likely going to look at the calibration records that were issued by the laboratory, and we're very likely going to look at gauge labeling that was applied by the laboratory. Now, none of those equivocate to a review of the actual calibration activity itself. In that scenario, none of the applicable clauses from ISO 9001:2015 that pertain to calibration, all of them from section 715, would be claimed as an exemption. We would include all of them, and we would audit the activities of the subcontractor. Now, one of the things that we do as part of our due diligence in a audit, and also here at headquarters when we do our executive committee review, is to review your website as part of the audit process. Remember that your website is admissible as audit evidence. Now, when we look at a website, we're looking for a number of things, and a couple of those things include, does the website appropriately reflect the scope? In other words, are the things that we've issued a certificate for the things that are reflected on your website? So if we've certified you for injection molding and your website talks about automobile distribution, that's completely different, and that would be concerning. Also, does your website reference design activity? And we have you classified as no design. Now, in the event that we find a reference to design on your website, usually we get one of a couple of explanations. Corporate provides the design. Well, we've now learned that that's not acceptable. Well, we don't really provide design. We just want to attract potential customers by saying that we do. Now, obviously, we understand the desire to grow a business. However, we can't accept that arrangement either. Your website and your design classification have to be aligned with each other. We did design our products, but they were all designed 30 to 40 years ago. Now, that has come up on rare occasions. And in those circumstances, typically, we will work out an arrangement with you. Let's talk for a minute about exemptions rooted in a limited scope. Now, most of our clients intend for their entire operation to be included in the certification. However, excuse me, we do have a small number of cases where the client wishes to have a limited scope, whether for financial or for other reasons. Where that is the case, it is possible that a portion of ISO 9001 may be considered for exemption that would not have been possible in a full scope situation. So let's take a look at an example. Let's suppose that we have a client that manufactures clothing for industrial and for commercial markets. For this example, we'll presume that there are two primary product lines, leather goods for industrial applications and polyester goods for commercial applications. Now, you may recall that Section 855 of ISO 9001:2015 includes warranty provisions. Let's assume that this organization offers warranty on their polyester products, but not on their leather products. If that company was to choose to only pursue ISO certification for their leather product line, they might be able to claim a full or partial exemption from Section 855 on the basis that the product line that is certified does not have any warranty associated with it. That's a possible example of an exemption rooted in a limited scope. So what happens if an inappropriate item is being claimed as an exemption? The most appropriate response of an incorrectly claimed exemption is typically going to be a nonconformance. Now, we've explored what the probable clause numbers to cite are going to be earlier in this presentation. Now, please remember that you do have the right to issue a dispute or an appeal of an auditor's decision. through our Pro 10 process. That's available on our website. Now, I want to spend some time on talking about design a little bit further. And I wanted to make you aware of a new classification option that we have. Earlier this year, we rolled out a new certification option for clients who receive all or some of their product designs from a parent or affiliate company. This option is called Full Design-Outsourced. Now, there are a couple of things that happen when we classify a client in this way. First of all, your audit time is potentially going to be calculated in the same manner used for a no design classification. We're going to clarify that in a few slides here. Any organization that is classified as full design outsourced must not claim any part of design as an exemption. And finally, the certificate that is issued to such a client will indicate design as part of the scope. Now, obviously, outsourced process controls must be assessed. When we rolled out our new full design outsourced classification, we reached out to ANAB, the accreditation body here in the United States, to make sure that we had their blessing on this process. ANAB generally indicated that they felt our new process was appropriate, but they emphasized that controls have to be applied to outsourced processes and that those controls have to be included in the audit process. So here's a couple of excerpts from what they had to say to us. The complexity, activities, and risks that are present due to an outsourced provider of processes, products, or services need to be controlled and confirmed as detailed in the standard in Section 8.4. Section 8.4 has many requirements that apply to the organization and must be confirmed or evaluated by the CB when certifying an organization with outsourced processes, products, or services. ANAB also indicated that they strongly object to any automatic time reduction regarding product design status. They stated, in all cases, the certification body, that's PJR, is required to clearly, effectively, and realistically justify and document justifications for any adjustment, either an increase or a decrease in audit time from the established audit day tables. These are the tables that are presented in IAF MD5. So in other words, PJR cannot be expected to initially reduce audit time for a classification of full design outsourced unless an on-site auditor has provided assurance that the controls applied to outsourced processes are mature, highly effective, and can be assessed with no added audit time. That's a very key point. So with that in mind, we now have 4 classification options pertaining to an organization's design status. Let's go ahead and review what those options are. We have full design. This is an organization, excuse me, that is responsible for the design of at least one of the products that they manufacture. All sections of Clause 8.3 are applicable for companies classified in this manner. We have no design. This is an organization that receives all designs from their customers or otherwise does not interact with product designs, such as warehouses or staffing companies. All sections of Clause 8.3 are claimed as not applicable for companies classified in this manner. Now, a special note here. If an organization receives product designs from parent or affiliate companies, but does not have any responsibility for product design and does not advertise or otherwise represent that they are responsible for any product design activities, they may also qualify for classification as no design. So there's a lot of specific verbiage there. Again, this is all going to be subject to verification during the audit process. Some of you on the call today may remember that we have a often not used, a very seldom used, I should say, classification option called partial design. This is for an organization that provides technical input, review, verification, or other similar design services to their clients, but does not typically have responsibility for final design approval. We actually have very few clients classified in this manner. If you are a partial design company, the expectation is that portions, but not all, of Clause 8.3 are going to be claimed as not applicable. And then, of course, we have full design outsourced, an organization that receives all or some of its product designs from parent or affiliate companies or subcontractors and advertises or otherwise represents that they are responsible for product design activity. In that situation, all sections of Clause 8.3 are applicable for those companies. In conclusion, PJR wants to ensure that our audit process is value added for our clients while addressing all applicable requirements. We also want to ensure that all exemptions are justified as part of the audit process. I would like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation on ISO 9001:2015. It's called Approaching Your Transition with Confidence. It's been updated within the past few months here. We've got some content from our first couple of years of auditing the new standard. We've learned some lessons from the ISO 9002 guidance standard. We have had a lot of participation on that webinar and some great feedback. We also have a presentation called Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a QMS Audit. That's shown on a quarterly basis. It is an exploration of the expectations that auditors will have on those two areas. And we've got a lot of other webinars. We have webinars on process mapping, on Stage 1 audits, on AS 9100 and other standards. We've got a lot of content for you, and we hope that you'll tune in for one of our other presentations. If you'd like to keep in touch, the best way for you to do that is to opt in. If you go to our website at www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, you will find a place to input your email address, click subscribe, and you'll be automatically informed of news updates, new webinars, and other helpful content. Okay, at this time I'll be glad to take your questions. Again, my apologies for kind of the rough start here. And do we have any questions on our presentation today? Okay, well, I'll thank you all very much for your attention to the presentation. I'll wish all of you a happy holiday season. Thank you very much.